You've seen all kinds of map projections. Computers today can morph the world into any image with just a few lines of code or a handful of mouse clicks. Before there were computers, the advanced mathematics of differential geometry let mathematicians design projections with a wide variety of properties. But what did cartographers do before computers and before calculus, even before algebra? What did they do when their tools were just the straightedge, the compass, and their minds? It's a question for which the answer was forgotten for over 200 years. Only recently have the secrets been rediscovered, and we're going to make sure they are never lost again. Get ready to learn some truly ancient mathematics here on the Eye of History. Welcome to my channel. Here at the Eye of History, we study all things maps and map making, and if you like probing explorations into history, culture, science, and more, then this channel is for you. And please, like, share, and subscribe. It's really important for nerdy channels like this one. This video was 500 years in the making. At least, that's how old these three maps from my collection are. They're all from the same cartographer, in fact, the same atlas. And until I started to make this video, I assumed they were all made in the same way. I was planning on using these maps as examples of the earliest map projection, but it seems that each of these maps were constructed using a different projection. So this video is going to be a little longer than I planned, which is awesome, because not only are you going to learn how the first projections worked, you're going to learn how they evolved too. And there's a lot more to this than I expected. We'll have to start from the very beginning. It all began almost 2,000 years ago with Claudius Ptolemy, a Greco-Roman who lived in Egypt in the 2nd century AD. He's best known today as an astronomer. Before Copernicus, people looked at Ptolemy to understand how the heavens moved. But he also wrote the most important work on cartography in human history, the Geographia. It was a massive work in two main parts. First, it gave thorough directions for how to make maps, world maps in particular, but regional maps as well. And second, it provided an incredible index of every known city, road, mountain, river, and sea in the world, at least every landmark known to the Romans. It was the ultimate reference, the entire science of cartography in one book. We'll fast forward to the Renaissance, more specifically to the invention of the printing press. Not much happened in between, unless we factor in a handful of pugnacious sailors who, using entirely their own methods, created some amazing sea charts. But they kept their charts entirely to themselves. Before the printing press, map making was an entirely bespoke process, rarely practiced and never with any attention to cartographic sensibilities. But once a map could be reliably reproduced, and more importantly, sold to a public hungry to know what the world looked like beyond their hometowns, cartography became a true profession. Anyone who could understand Ptolemy's methods, who could penetrate his antiquated prose and understand his geometric constructions, could go into business. The surveying part was already done. Every landmark was listed right there in the Geographia. Lorenz Fries was just such a man. Born in 1490 in Alsace, he settled in Strasbourg and built a career as a writer on medical topics. Strasbourg was a major center of the printing industry, and amongst its leaders was Johann Gruneger, who was responsible for printing many of the most important and successful maps of the era. After participating in some minor ways on some projects, Fries got his big break from Gruneger. Together, they published their own version of the Geographia. In particular, they published a set of maps based on Ptolemy's methods and tables. It was, sadly, not much of a success. It might have been more popular if, in addition to the several dozen regional maps, it had included something a little more spectacular, a world map. But unfortunately for Gruneger, Fries was late in getting the world map done, and it ended up getting printed separately. Fries then went back to writing medical texts, his cartographic adventure over. Gruneger tried to recoup his losses with a second printing, and eventually the blocks were sold to two French brothers who continued to try to squeeze a profit from them, with modest results. So, as a cartographer, Fries was clearly a mediocrity. And that's probably a good thing for our video, because it means that these maps won't be tainted by the creator's anachronistic genius. We're going to see Ptolemy's methods and the methods of the Renaissance in the raw. To understand Ptolemy, we first have to understand what he was trying to accomplish. Today, we think of a projection as an attempt to take the curved surface of the globe and flatten it onto the page, cutting and stretching it however necessary. Ptolemy had little interest in that idea. To Ptolemy, a sphere and a plane were ideal surfaces, and the idea of deforming one to fit the other contradicted basic notions of space and measure. One insuperable hurdle was that any attempt to map the sphere to the plane requires an infinite number of infinitesimal deformations, and neither type of infinity would be acceptable to a strong, mathematically inclined mind like Ptolemy. Infinity was where logic was defeated by paradox. What Ptolemy was after wasn't a mathematical projection, but an optical illusion. He was trying to give the impression of sphericity to a flat image, a simple sort of perspective, a basic trompe l'oeil. He starts by imagining a globe marked with latitudes and longitudes, as seen from a distance high over the equator, like we see here. For Ptolemy, it would not have been much of a challenge to make a map essentially like this one. It requires only a little common sense and the ability to construct the cosine of an angle. Easy peasy for the greatest astronomer of the classical era. But Ptolemy wasn't interested in this map. He noted that the important parts, the parts of the world where all the people that he knew about lived, the oikoumene, was stuck high up in the top half, shrunken and distorted. He wanted to bring his home, Alexandria, to the center of the map, something more like this. Unfortunately, this is not something that even Ptolemy could do properly. Ptolemy's only tools were the basics, compass and straightedge. And here the shift turned those straight lines of latitude into ellipses, flattened circles that could only be approximated, never duplicated with the tools at hand. Yes, Ptolemy was fully aware that it is possible to draw an ellipse using 2 pins and a piece of string, but if you've ever tried it, you'll know that that isn't really a practical solution. And he was looking for a practical solution. Remember, he was only looking to create the illusion of a sphere. So Ptolemy was content with a very practical solution to simply approximate those ellipses using the compass, drawing circular arcs that roughly match their curves. Let's see how he does it. He started with a circle and its equator and a central meridian. Then he drew a line at the latitude that he wanted to base his map on. The area just above the line is going to be where the viewer's eye is drawn. Ptolemy chose the parallel at 36 degrees, which cuts through the Mediterranean just south of Greece and right through Rhodes. The latter fact is probably why he chose it. Rhodes was a major center of learning, especially of astronomy, and Ptolemy was used to using the so-called parallel of Rhodes in his calculations. But it's a good choice regardless. As we'll see, his map centers very nicely on the most interesting parts of the oikoumene, and as a bonus, we'll see later how this choice simplified his work. Now, to simplify the explanation, I'm going to add a few details that Ptolemy didn't bother to explain. Since it's 90 degrees from the equator to the North Pole, we'll say that the radius of this circle is 90 units. Later on, that'll make it easier to go back and forth between angles and lengths, but we still have to be careful to remember that a, quote, unit is not a, quote, degree. I'll try to be careful as we go. Ptolemy's goal was to approximate the ellipse made by the parallel of Rhodes on the real globe after the globe was shifted. Remember that the particular ellipse just touched the equator at its lowest point, then disappeared beyond the edge of the globe roughly at its original level. So Ptolemy wanted to draw an arc that connected the center of the circle to this point, the point where the parallel met the edge of the globe. That arc needed to be centered on the main axis as well. This is the point where you might curse yourself for not paying more attention in your high school geometry class, or you might want to thank your teacher if you remember how to do this with Ptolemy's tools, compass and straightedge. First, you draw a line between the 2 points that we want to connect, like so. Then we draw the perpendicular bisector of that segment. That just takes 2 equal arcs with a compass, one centered on each point, like so, and then drawing the line defined by where they cross. like so. The point where that line crosses the central meridian will be the center of our last arc, right here. And now we can draw the arc like so. It's an elementary exercise in symmetry to see why this works. The construction created two congruent triangles, here and here, and therefore our 2 points are equidistant from the common vertex, so the arc runs through both points. I'm going to simplify the drawing a bit before continuing, just to make the next steps clearer. Actually, we're almost done. From here, Ptolemy simply drew additional arcs of latitude wherever he wanted for his maps. He personally put at the top of the map the so-called parallel of Thule at 63 degrees. In case you're curious, that puts Thule at the latitude of central Norway, a bit south of Trondheim, well north of the Faroe and Shetland Isles. I'll draw both the original straight parallel, it'll go 63 units up from the center, and now the new arc, again centered on the vertex we drew earlier. To finish, we need to draw the meridians. Here is where that units degree equivalence comes in. Ptolemy was well aware that he couldn't make a map in which no distances were distorted. He focused on making the distances on the baseline, the parallel of Rhodes, and on the central meridian as accurate as possible. This was not too hard to accomplish. He already knew that if you follow the parallel of Rhodes all the way around the Earth, the trip will be about 80% as long as if you followed the equator around the Earth. And what is true of the equator is true of the central meridian. Therefore, 4 length units on the parallel of Rhodes is as many degrees as 5 length units on the central meridian. If you want to mark the parallel at 5-degree intervals, just adjust your compass to 4 units and start making the parallel starting at the middle. Ptolemy knew that he wasn't marking the degrees perfectly, but the approximation is good to about 99%. Where did that 80% number come from? It's the bonus payoff for using 36 degrees as the baseline. 80% is the cosine of 36 degrees. Actually, the cosine is closer to 80.9%, and thus the length of the 36th parallel is 80.9% of the length of the equator. Decimal notation didn't exist in Ptolemy's time. Trigonometric values had to be expressed in fractions, and calculating with fractions like 809 over 1000 was an enormous pain. Rounding that off to 4/5 made everything so much easier. All that remains to make the map is just plotting the features that Ptolemy very helpfully listed in the Geographia. And the final result is something like this map. This one is not by Fries, but by another Strasbourg cartographer, Martin Waldseemüller. From this map, you can see there's one problem with Ptolemy's method. Anything south of the equator ends up getting grossly enlarged. Ptolemy's solution to this was to tack on at the equator this rather abominable appendage. He won't mind if I skip the instructions. He didn't like it any better than I do. I should point out that Ptolemy was not content with his method. He devised a second method which he considered far superior, but was much more difficult to construct. A few Renaissance-era cartographers did try it, the most spectacular example being Waldseemüller's famous map of 1507. This is the map that gave America its name. Not content with 2 methods, Ptolemy described a third. Unfortunately, his description was rather obtuse. No one since has succeeded in making a map based on it. Now that we understand Ptolemy's methods, let's look at Fries's maps. The first map is of Scythia Extra, modern Siberia, more or less. You can see Serica Regnum here, the Silk Kingdom, China. This map represented the very limits of Greek and Roman knowledge of the Far East, and as you can see, they didn't know much. But today we're not interested in what's on the map. That will wait for another video. We're interested in whether this map was really made according to Ptolemy's methods. We'll ignore the fact that Fries made one major simplification. The top and bottom parallels are drawn as straight lines. They should have a slight curve to them, but we'll forgive Fries for that. The difference it makes to our measurements is too small to worry about. To test, I took 3 measurements on each map. On any Ptolemaic map, the central meridian should be free from distortion, so I'll measure that and check our other measurements against it. We'll measure the top and bottom parallels and see if they match the ratios produced from Ptolemy's instructions. I made a simple spreadsheet to do all the calculation. Here are the formulas. They all come straight from the diagram we made earlier with just a smidgen of trigonometry applied. You'll notice that this map stretches from 36 degrees to 63 degrees, from Rhodes to Thule, exactly as Ptolemy preferred. I made all my measurements and was surprised. It turns out the proportions are off. It appears when Fries constructed it, he made a mistake. He ended up placing his vertex 10 units too far south. All I can say is, it seemed that Fries had some learning to do. Let's see if he did better on this second map. This one is of Sarmatia, what is now the part of Russia between the Ukraine and Kazakhstan. Here in the bottom left corner is the Black Sea, and here is a mountain range that doesn't actually exist. Maybe if it did, there wouldn't be a war going on there right now. This map stretches from 46 degrees to 61 degrees. It seems Fries developed a little more confidence and was willing to stray from Ptolemy's preferred parallels. I made the same measurements and plugged them into my spreadsheet. Once again, they didn't match Ptolemy's calculations. In fact, they're way off. This time the vertex is at 87 units. That's a huge mistake. So huge that I couldn't imagine it was a mistake. So I played with my spreadsheet a little bit and figured out what happened. Fries was actually dead on. The previous map, and most other maps of the era, used the parallel of Rhodes as the baseline. But since this map starts on the 46-degree parallel, Fries ran through the construction using 46 degrees instead of 36 degrees. That puts the vertex at 87 units instead of 113. And that makes this map exactly correct. It's an impressive leap in understanding on Fries's part. Not only did he do the construction perfectly, he modified the construction to match the specific map. After seeing this, I couldn't wait to analyze the third map. This one covers Scythia Intra, what's now Kazakhstan and its neighbors. The Mare Hyrcanum is the Caspian Sea. It's an interesting map that will get its own video as well. Like the first map, this one also stretches from 36 to 63 degrees, and I expected it to use the same geometry as the first map. I was shocked that it doesn't. Not at all. In fact, to make it fit Ptolemy's method, I had to assume some fairly ridiculous values, as though Fries was severely drunk when he made it. I couldn't believe that to be true, so I started to check some other possibilities. It didn't take long to decipher the mystery. In 1525, there weren't a lot of possibilities. One of my first thoughts was that Fries might have come into contact with, or perhaps read about, a globe maker. In 1525, globes were the ultimate status object, particularly among heads of state. Ever since Da Gama and Columbus, the other side of the world had become a matter of intense curiosity, and its precise geography was the subject of the most important political conflicts of the era. Every political player wanted a globe to better make sense of the situation. But globes are a whole lot harder to create than a map. Just getting a properly round ball of papier-mâché was a challenge. Getting the map drawn on it was even trickier. The method was straightforward enough. You drew your map on a set of gores, a line of parallel wedges. In this example, the 360-degree sphere of the Earth is divided into 12 gores, each of which has a width of 30 degrees. This example is printed as a do-it-yourself kit, although I doubt too many people actually tried to make a sphere precisely the size of these gores, then carefully cut the gores out and glue them onto their sphere, smoothing out the folds and crinkles that inevitably appeared. A professional globe would have used far more than 12 gores. The more gores, the fewer crinkles. But the more gores, the more effort has to go into making all the lines on the gores line up. But Fries wasn't trying to make a globe, but he realized that these gores were as close to distortion-free as anyone could imagine in 1525. They certainly distorted the landforms less than all the permutations that Ptolemy was performing. So for this third map, he threw out the Ptolemaic idea of providing the visual illusion of sphericity. He simply drew a gore, or actually a chunk of a particular gore, and then didn't glue it to a globe. The one simplification he made was to straighten the sides. This did introduce some additional distortion, but greatly simplified the whole process. When I tested my theory with a ruler, I found the measurements to be dead on. The technique is one of the simplest possible. Today we would call it a simplified sinusoidal projection, and for a medium scale like this map, it's close to ideal. It only has one significant flaw, which we'll see when we compare the accuracy of all three maps together. The way we'll compare the maps is by checking the amount of distortion in each part of the map. We'll check the corners and the midpoints, and at each point we'll draw a circle with a constant radius. Except that circle will get distorted according to how much the distances on the map are distorted at that point. A perfect map would have all the circles remain perfect circles, all the same size. These maps aren't perfect, they'll be ellipses, and they won't all be the same size. We'll start with Fries's first map. We'll see the vertical dimensions are perfect in the center, but get stretched on the left and right edges. This will be the case on all three maps and is due to the fact that Fries straightened out the top and bottom edges to simplify his work. There's more variation on the horizontal. Interestingly enough, the horizontal dimensions are nearly perfect on the top edge. If he had followed Ptolemy correctly on this map, it would be perfect, or nearly perfect, on the bottom edge. I don't think Fries did this deliberately. I think he just got lucky in his mistakes. On the second map, like we expect, we see the near-perfect bottom edge. But surprisingly, even though this was the map where he showed a perfect grasp of Ptolemy's method, the result is actually more distorted than the first map. It turns out moving the baseline to 46 degrees backfired. Although it put the map area front and center figuratively, it also increased the distortion. You can grasp this intuitively by asking the question, what would happen if we moved the baseline way, way up, say almost to the North Pole? Think back to Ptolemy's original concept of shifting the globe. The North Pole would end up near the center of the map with everything else arcing around it in a variation of a polar projection. Polar projections are kind of pretty, but they distort terribly anything not right around the pole. Finally, we have Fries's third map, the one based on the gores. At center top and center bottom, it's perfect. At the left and right, we see the same distortion as the other maps, the distortion due to the straightening out of the parallel edges. In the middle of the map, we see some distortion on the horizontal. He could have eliminated this by letting the left and right edges bulge out the way they do on globe gores, but Fries obviously thought this was more effort than it was worth. A modern cartographer would have one other complaint. Accuracy is most important at the center of a map. A modern cartographer would have adjusted the horizontal scale slightly to make the central parallel perfect and moved the distortion to the top and bottom edges. Still, it's nice to see how Fries's methods evolved, and I believe that it's fair to say his evolution is a fair representation of the entire cartographic field in the Renaissance era. The first cartographers followed Ptolemy slavishly, though not always correctly. But over time, they gained more confidence in their abilities and brought in new ideas from other fields, eventually moving past Ptolemy's less fruitful ideas and substituting their own. It's important to note that the new ideas weren't fully formed. They too had flaws, which had to be worked out over time. Until Johann Lambert ruined the fun by reducing projections to a purely mathematical exercise and partial differential equations, map projections were an experimental science, and cartographers were amazingly and amusingly creative. To the historian, Ptolemy is the prime mover, the most important name in cartography, and the Geographia is one of the most easily available classic texts of its kind. So it's rather surprising that for at least 200 years, the understanding of his methods of projection were lost. From 1805 until just a few years ago, at least a dozen scholars penned descriptions of Ptolemy's projections, and not one got it right. Each characterized the projection as a conic or pseudo-conic projection and glided past the 25-degree gap at the top of the map, treating it as an accident or arbitrary decision by Ptolemy. Only one historian recognized the importance of that difference, but he failed to figure out how Ptolemy constructed it. Only recently did a Hungarian historian of cartography, Gyula Papay, rediscover Ptolemy's method. Why the blind spot? Simple. It's an example of that old adage, when you have a hammer in your hand, every screw looks like a nail. In 1772, the great polymath Johann Heinrich Lambert applied his knowledge of advanced calculus to the problem of the map projection and instantly turned the entire subject into a branch of mathematics. Every scholar since has approached the question with Lambert's mathematical concepts in their heads. As they read Ptolemy, they forgot that Ptolemy didn't have the calculus. He didn't even have the concept of a function or a mapping to work from. Ptolemy just had a compass, a straight edge, and an incredible intuition. For a fuller explanation, I left a link to Papay's paper in the description. As ever, like, share, and subscribe, and let me know in the comments what else you would like to know about these 500-year-old maps.